Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress with the next video in the countdown towards the resumption of the 2020 Candidates Tournament. The second half is going to resume on Sunday, November 1st, and as I'm recording this video, that's only 6 weeks, 42 days away. We're counting down towards the resumption of that great event by looking at the 29 earlier candidates cycles in the history of the official World Championship. It started in 1883 with a tournament in London which was won by Johannes Zukertort, second was Wilhelm Steinitz, and 3 years later these two players played the first official World Championship match. In 1896, Steinitz came second in the St. Petersburg tournament, which gained him the right for a rematch against world champion Lasker. Paul Keres won the event in Netherlands 1938, but World War II stood in the way of him getting a World Championship match against world champion Alexander Alyoshin. The first official candidates tournament was held in 1950 and was won by David Bronstein. Vasily Smyslov won 2 candidate cycles. In Zurich 1953 he won the candidates tournament. It is in red there because that is what this video is about. We're going to look at a game from that event, and he also qualified in Amsterdam 1956. Misha Tal qualified for the World Championship match in 1959 and he became world champion by beating world champion Mikhail Botvinnik. Tigran Petrosyan won Curaçao 1962 and became world champion the next year. Boris Spassky also won 2 candidate cycles in Tbilisi 1965 and Kiev 1968. By then the candidate cycle had gone from a candidates tournament to candidate matches. Bobby Fischer qualified by beating Tigran Petrosyan in Buenos Aires 1971 for the match of the century the year after against Spassky. Karpov beat Korchnoi in Moscow 1974 and became world champion by default when Bobby Fischer declined to defend his title. Viktor Korchnoi also won 2 candidate cycles, lost both times to Karpov in a World Championship match. And in 1984 Kasparov came and became world champion the next year. Karpov came back, won 2 candidate cycles, beat Andrei Sokolov in Linares 1987 and Jan Timman in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia in 1990. And in 1993 it was Nigel Short's turn. He beat Jan Timman in the final for a match against Kasparov. Anand was the next one to qualify for a match against Kasparov, and the one after that was Shirov. He beat Kramnik in Cazorla in 1998 but never got a match. The man he defeated, Kramnik, did get a match in 2000 and became the 14th world champion. Peter Leko won Dortmund 2002 and qualified to challenge Kramnik, which was held 2 years later. And in Lista 2007, 4 players qualified for the World Championship tournament: Aranyan, Gelfand, Grishuk and Leko. Anand took the world title and beat Topalov and Gelfand in the next 2 cycles, but lost to Magnus Carlsen. Anand qualified again for the rematch against Carlsen by winning Khanty-Mansiysk 2014. And Karyakin and Caruana were the last 2 challengers to win the candidates tournaments. Who will it be? Yekaterinburg 2020. The winner will gain the right to challenge world champion Magnus Carlsen for the world title. As mentioned in this video, we're going to look at a game from the famous Zurich 1953 tournament. Probably the most famous candidates tournament in history because of the level of the players, because of the great games that were played, and because of the famous tournament books from David Bronstein and Miguel Najdorf. A grueling tournament, 15 participants, double round robin, so 28 rounds, and Vasily Smyslov finished on 18 points out of 28 games, 2 points ahead of Bronstein, Keres and Reshevsky. And if I told you that of these 15 players, now in September 2020, only one of them is still alive, would you know who that is? It's the Grandmaster there in 10th place, Yuri Averbakh, is still going strong at the age of 98. We're going to look at the game from the tournament winner, Vasily Smyslov, on the 13th of October 1953. In round 24 he had the black pieces against Paul Keres from Estonia, and I'm taking the notes from Garry Kasparov from his series My Great Predecessors on this game. Keres was white and played c4. Keres, of course, as we just saw from the tournament table, was also still in contention to win a tournament and qualify for the World Championship match against Botvinnik. He played c4, knight f6 from Smyslov, knight c3, e6, let's put the opening moves on the board, knight f3, c5, e3, bishop e7, we have an English opening on the board, b3, castling from Smyslov, bishop b2, fianchettoing that bishop, and b6. Smyslov himself writes that this variation with b6 promises more interesting play than the variation with d5 instead. He shows this variation, c takes d5, knight takes, queen takes, and bishop c4, kicking the queen. Smyslov says this gives an early tendency towards simplification. So b6 was played by Smyslov, which gives more interesting play. d4 from Keres, the pawn was taken, e takes, and now d5 striking in the center. Bishop d3 developing, knight c6 developing, castling from Keres, and bishop b7 on the long diagonal. Rook c1, Kasparov says white has played the opening unpretentiously, and he says queen e2 is the move from modern theory. But rook c1 was played in 1953. Rook c8, rook e1, knight b4, attacking the bishop, wanting to gain the bishop pair, but Keres says no, I do not want to part with the bishop pair, and played bishop f1. Knight e4, Smyslov writes a typical tactical device enabling black to relieve the situation. a3 from Keres, kicking that knight on b4. Knight takes c3, attacking the queen, so you have to recapture. Don't recapture with the bishop, because then there is knight a2, as Kasparov explains. That is a fork on these two pieces. You have to save the rook, rook c2, knight takes c3, rook takes, and then the pawn on a3 is hanging. This is good for black. So after knight takes c3, don't take back with the bishop, but take with the rook, which is what Keres did. The knight on b4 is attacked, so went back to c6. And here c takes d5 is a move, as Kasparov explains, but knight e5 was played by Keres. That knight was taken, rook takes, bishop f6 hitting the rook, and the rook went to h5. And Keres has his eyes on an attack on black's king. Let's look at the crude threat, as Kasparov calls it. Let's make a very silly move for black, just to show the threat. Let's play a6. Then there is rook takes h7. Kasparov says this is the crude threat, but against Smyslov such tricks don't work, and he gives this variation. Black takes, queen h5 check. You only have one move. Rook h3 with a checkmate threat. On the h-file, bishop h4 is the only move to prevent that. That bishop gets taken, but then you can play f5. The bishop was blocking the f-pawn, but now it can play, making some air for the king. And here Kasparov gives queen h7 check, while my engine says that bishop e2 is the best move here, with a better position for white. But after rook h5, Smyslov did not go into that, and he played g6, hitting the rook. And look at this move from Keres, rook c to h3, leaving the rook on h5 en prise. Bronstein rated Keres' idea quite highly, but as Kasparov writes, the originality of an idea and its practical result is often something quite different. And Kasparov is right, of course. What to do here? Do you take the rook? Smyslov after the game said that he very much wanted to take the rook, since he did not see how white could win after g takes h5, queen takes, and then rook e8. But his intuition said something different. Instead of taking the rook, he played the logical move d takes c4 after a lengthy thought. Kasparov writes, common sense prevailed, a natural, purely Smyslov-like move. With the opening of the center, black immediately gains counterplay. He threatens c4, c3, that's a move we'll see in the game, and his rook on c8, his queen on d8, and his bishop on b7 all come into play. and there is no checkmate for white. For the moment, the bishop on f6 holds everything together. Interesting to see Kasparov explanations. So d takes c4 was the right move, and now queen g4 would have promised a draw, explains Kasparov after a lot of analysis. But rook takes h7 was played in the game, and that move gets a double question mark from Kasparov. And he writes, at a critical moment, Keres' nerves fail, and he commits a fatal mistake. Because now Smyslov played that move that we saw already, c4, c3, and Kasparov says, essentially, it is all over. Not because of a material gain for black, but all his pieces are better than white's. What happens if you take the pawn? Bishop takes c3, rook takes, and then the rook on h7 is hanging. This is good for black. What about saving the bishop with bishop c1, for example? Then there is queen takes d4, and this is also good for black. Everything is good for black. In the game after c3, Keres played queen c1. And be careful with black, don't be greedy, don't take that bishop, because then white will win this game of chess. After queen h6, there is a forced checkmate on the board. There's nothing black can do. For example, you can promote the pawn to a queen, but then there is rook g7 check. Bishop takes is the only move, and this is checkmate, and white wins. And maybe it would have been Keres who would have won this candidates tournament. But Smyslov saw that, don't take the bishop, and he played queen takes d4 instead, the strongest move in the position. Queen h6, desperation from Keres, trying to checkmate his opponent, but rook f2 d8, and as Smyslov himself writes, at just the right time. Now the threat of rook h8 is parried, because the h8 square is covered 3 times by black. And the tripling on the h-file does not achieve its aim. Great calculation from Smyslov. It looks very dangerous with all those pieces on the h-file, but he had seen that there is no checkmate. And if there is no checkmate, all white's pieces are badly positioned. After rook f to d8, Keres played bishop c1, bishop g7 hitting the queen, queen g5, queen f6 offering a queen trade, queen g4 and c2. Kasparov shows that the main threat is now rook d1. Let's see that move in action. Let's play a very silly move for white this time. Let's play a4. Then rook d1 is played. It hits the bishop, and white cannot protect the bishop in a good way. And if the bishop plays, the pawn promotes. For example, queen g5 to protect the bishop, but then there is queen takes, bishop takes, and the pawn indeed promotes. If after c2 you play bishop g5 straight away, then the pawn promotes on c1, bishop takes f6, and black has an extra piece, and there still is nothing to gain for white on the h-file. In the game after c2, with that rook d1 threat, Keres played bishop e2, and rook d4 was Smyslov's 26th move. Material-wise, black is only a pawn up, but that pawn is on c2, and all black's pieces are stronger than their counterparts. Just look at that poor rook on h7, not taking part in the game at all. Also, his queen is now attacked, so f4 was played, but that enabled Smyslov to carry out a mating combination. Rook d1 check. Smyslov finds the winning tactical shot. The rook was taken, bishop takes d1, but then queen d4 check was the final move of the game with a forced checkmate, and Keres resigned here. Let's look at a mating variation. It is a forced checkmate, there's nothing you can do against it. Let's look at one example. We're in check, so we have to do something about that. Let's interpose the rook. It's not doing anything on h3 anyway. Then there is c takes d1 queen check, and after queen takes, king f2, the rook comes in with check, king g3, rook takes g2 check, protected by the bishop, king h4, and checkmate on g4. Keres saw these variations. After queen d4 check, he threw in the towel, and Vasily Smyslov had won a crucial game. with the black pieces against one of his main rivals in the tournament. Keras did not have his nerves under control after so many rounds. He went for the kill, for checkmate. Smyslov calculated everything, did not panic by seeing 2 rooks and a queen on the h-file, and reeled in the point after only 28 moves. I hope you enjoyed this game and that you'll keep counting down towards the resumption of the Candidates Tournament with me. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, please subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel, and please leave a comment. I will read them all and I will reply to them all. If you like the video, if you like this series, then please share it on social media by clicking the share button on YouTube. You can find me on Instagram, on Twitter and on Facebook. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.